In this video, I'm going to go through my mixing process. It's very important when you're writing a song for a score for film or television that the song's mixed to commercial standards for broadcast standards, so that there are no issues, no sound issues, and that whenever it's broadcast on television. Um, I'll just get stuck in. Basically, I started by in the last video I showed you how I wrote the song in Logic using MIDI and sample libraries and software synthesizers. Um, what As I said in that video, you should always solo and bounce down or export each element as audio, and then create a new session and drag that audio in for mixing purposes. I mean, this isn't the golden rule, but it's just good housekeeping. For me, I like to have everything separate in the mixing stage. Some people do mix as they go along, and it's completely fine. It doesn't really matter as long as the final song sounds good. But I like to keep the processes separate. I can come in with fresh ears and start the mix from scratch, so that the writing doesn't interrupt the mixing and the mixing doesn't interrupt the writing. In this song, there are some MIDI parts that I added on later, and I'll explain why in a bit. But I'm just going to show you straight up how I got started, and I'll take it from there. So I dragged all my layers that I'd bounced as audio. You can see every element, including the drums. Each layer has got its own track. Drag them in, and I color code them. So by coloring them, you just basically highlight them and press Command C, pick the color, and then you want to go into your mixing window and also make sure the colors match in there as well. And also naming them is really important. Again, you could do this in any way you want, but it's just general good practice. Keeps everything tidy and allows you to come back and open that session at a later time and make tweaks if you need to. So I dragged everything in. I named all the sessions. I grouped them all here so that they're all the same colors. And I also edited them anywhere that's silent. I cut out so that it's easy to see arrangement wise. You can see here the song starts, and then these layers come in later in the song. Now that allows me visually to arrange the song and mix it accordingly. Now in the mixing window, don't get too overwhelmed here. Each of these layers, you can see that highlights that, that highlights that. Each of these layers here is also got its own mixing channel here. Now there's two ways to mix. You can click a track here and mix it on this individual channel strip, or you can mix it in the mixing window. This looks like more like a traditional mixing desk. Again, it's just a visual way to group everything together and mix it accordingly. Now, I like to keep everything organized. My instrument layers are all on the left. So there's my kick, all my drums, bass, my effects, my orchestra, string stuff here, my guitars, my organs, sirens, some more. Oh, that's more orchestra that I've got in the wrong color. Now at the very end of here is important. These are all my effects. Now you can add effects. So let's talk about an effect like reverb. You can add an individual reverb to every channel if you want. So I could pick that snare. Oh, it's not letting me. I could pick that cymbal and I could add a reverb here. Pick the reverb you like, and you could do that for every layer. But what I do is allocate an effect to an individual channel bus over here on the right. This is very standard practice, and the reason you would do this, so I've got my reverb, short reverb, medium reverb, long, delay short, delay long, FX send. These, I'll go into these a little bit later. These are individual effects. Now by doing this on the bus, a channel at the end, allows you to then send any instrument. You can go to the bus, you can select it, you can send a little bit of that cymbal to that one reverb, you can send a little bit of that kick, you can send a little bit of that string, all to this one reverb. That keeps everything consistent. Now it gets a bit muddy if you start adding a different reverb for every single channel. And what I do is I create a Logic mixing template that has these reverbs and delays and all my other effects that I like set up. Now, in theory, that means I can drag, if I start with the same template, I can drag any stems, in and mix them using this session, and the songs will all sort of sound like they belong in the same space. I mean, it's a very basic way to explain it, but I've picked these reverbs. I've picked them based on their sounds, their colors, the textures, things that I like. And so, in theory, by using those same effects on every song, say for I did mix 10 songs in an album, every one of those songs could be recorded by a different person, but by mixing them all in this one session, they inherently sound sonically like they belong in the one space. Now, that's again a very, very basic way to explain it, but by using these same reverbs, I can make three different songs sound like they belong, like they were one band playing in one room. And that's very, very important when it comes to music production. So this session here, I use it for every single Weary Pines song. And Don, I write songs with Don, my partner. Don writes his songs in software called Reason, and I write mine in Logic. But he can send me his stems when the song's finished, and I can mix them in this same Logic session, and it'll sound like his song was recorded in the same room that my song was recorded in, to some extent. Now, let's get started on the song. Good practice. When you drag all the audio in, what I like to do, drag everything in, color code it, name it, bring all the channels down to 0. Let me just get the master here. Okay, so you get your master channel. Your master channel is the channel that controls the whole track as a whole. Now, if you add an effect to that master, it'll affect the entire song. Whereas if you add an effect to an individual channel, it'll just affect that layer of the song. And it allows you to get really granular. You want to get the song to sound good as a whole, and you want to get every element to sound good together. And on the master channel, what I like to add is I add this little exciter. I mean, that just, it's a vintage exciter. It just adds a little bit of high-end grit to the entire mix. It's called heightened mix. Again, it just changes, I guess you could call it the color of the whole song at the end, but I would turn that off to begin with. What I do always start with is I'll add a gain, and I'll turn mono on. Now, this is just a little mixing tip. This is not, again, it's not a golden rule. Not everyone will do this. But if you mix an entire track in mono and then you turn the mono off, it sounds completely better. Now, I'll try to go into that in a little bit more detail to show you later. What I do, I turn the mono on, so everything's in mono. I turn every channel, I select every channel of the track and turn it down to 0. And then what's recommended is you often loop the busiest part of the track. Now for this song, it would probably be when it kicks in, it's heavy, when there's guitar, when most elements of the song are there. Now let me press play on this so you can hear it. Now in theory, if I mix that one section of the song, every other section around the song will sound, within reason, will sound balanced. So the first stage, you turn everything down and you do what's called gain staging. Now gain staging is what probably the average person will think a mixing engineer does. It's adjusting these faders so that the song sounds balanced. No individual layer is too loud, too quiet. Use the effects then to sort of shape the sounds themselves so that they're all balanced even further. And you do that quite granularly by going in and adjusting that one sound individually, and then you listen to how it sounds as part of the whole mix. Now I'll start off showing you. Let me start. Where's a good place to start? The drums, often a good place to start. If you can get the drums really balanced, and then you can start adjusting, start turning up the knobs or the faders, sorry, for the other elements, then you're going to get a start with quite a balanced mix. Again, this is something that takes a long time to learn, and the most important thing is your ears. You should be able to inherently hear what sounds good and what doesn't sound good, and that all I can recommend for that is practice. Um, but I'm going to talk you through how I do it, and maybe you can pick up something. So there you go. I've got my drums highlighted. Now, I want to just take a moment to explain why there's some MIDI in this track, even though I told you about bouncing the audio. Now, the reason there's MIDI in this is because once the song was written, I actually sent it off to our new drummer, Bryson Whittington. And Bryson basically was able to take the demo and the really crap drums that I had programmed in, and he's able to use his MIDI drum controller to record new drums, then send me that MIDI back, and I was able to feed that MIDI through the same drum sampler that I used in my drums, which was the EZdrummer, and I used this metal preset. Now that means that even though he's performed the drums, they now sound exactly like the drums that were previously on the song. I mean, you can always record live drums. In my opinion, one of the biggest giveaways in like an amateur mix or demo or something that's not commercially produced is how the drums have been recorded. It's incredibly hard to record drums and to get a really good sounding mix. It often requires a lot of patience and a lot of good expensive microphones and mic placement, and obviously a great drummer. But in this day and age, just like the in the last video, I talked about how you can get these string orchestras, these sample libraries. Well, it's the same with drums. You get these amazing drum libraries, EZdrummer metal drums. It's quite literally every individual drum hit, depending on how hard you hit the sample, controls how loud it is. That's quite literally triggering a sample of someone's performance of a drum. Now, if I've fed Bryson's MIDI through that, let me just show you. See how great that sounds? And there's very little going on with the mix itself, actually. Well, I've got some effects going, but what I like to do is group all the drums to begin with. So I've got them all feeding through into an individual aux or a bus. Now that's here. Now, like I explained earlier, this any effect I put on this channel will affect all the drums if they're all fed through that bus. So I've got them all feeding through into this drum. Let me just into this drum channel, and I've added the drum exchanger by SPL, and let me just show you. This is just a bit of dynamics. I've got my satin tape machine. Now I've got this is it's a bit of tape delay, or sorry, tape saturation, and this is just to add a bit of color. These are just things that I've picked over time that I like the sound of. And I've got my VEQ. This is just a very slight EQ on the drums, and my compression. Now this affects all the drums as one. I've also then mixed the drums individually. Sorry, let me just. Each drum's been shaped with EQ. So I wanted the sound of that snare to have a little bit of higher frequency and to cut a little bit of the low end out. Again, I'm really trying to keep this video short enough. I can go into very detailed videos later about how to mix drums and what each of these effects are. But EQ in a nutshell is cutting and adding frequencies to a sound to shape it within the mix. So your drums might sound okay, but you might realize that the kick's not cutting through, so you might go into your kick and you might add an EQ. Sorry, that's the wrong one. You might add an EQ. See, I've done this EQ. This particular kick, I've cut out a lot of the mids and a little bit of the highs, and I've added a little bit of a peak on just the lower end of the mids, just around that, that 40 to 100 frequency, just to give it a bit of a boost in that frequency. And what that means is like that kick, the sound of that kick sounded, in my opinion, slightly better by boosting that part of the sound. Or it cut, not even better, sometimes it can be that it just cuts through the mix better. Now I've very quickly balanced these drums using gain staging, which is just like I said earlier, moving the fader so that the drums sound balanced, right? And then I've gone through with EQs and made the snare sound slightly sharper, made that kick cut through the mix slightly in the middle. I've used compression. Compression is it's a way to control the dynamics, like I explained earlier. It basically allows when a certain sound is performed, for example, in this case, the snare, when the snare hits, this effect controls the way that that audio cuts through the mix dynamically. Other than that, on drums, I've added very little effects. What I have done is I've sent them to buses. So let me see here. So we've got the snare going to snare reverb, also going to just the general large reverb in the mix. I've got it going to drum reverb and NY drums. Now NY drums are parallel compression. Another effect which I'm not going to go into right now, but I'll try and speed it up here. Each of these is going to ascend, which I've set up here, and by having each of these effects on their own send, it means I can send any number of drums into the snare reverb. I can send all the snares into this one reverb, and then it'll make them all sound like they belong together in that reverb. So once you've got your drums mixed, Bryson's drums I should say, I've also got my own drums that I originally programmed. Now let's say we're mixing this now and I don't like how that snare sounds. I can adjust can bring the fader up. This channel here is exactly the same as it is here. Say I want to cut through slightly more. Let's say the sound of it's slightly, I want it to be like slightly brighter. I can turn the so that's, you would often mix in groups, so I would mix the drums as a whole. I would get the gain stage them so that they all sound good as a group, as if it's a real drummer on stage and I'm mixing using a desk. Now once you've got the drums sounding good, you might want to then bring in the bass. This is the way I would do it. You can do it any way you want. Some people start with the vocals in a song, some people start with the bass. I like to start with the drums and then I would bring in the bass. So I've got my bass here. Again, it's already been mixed, but I'll just turn the bass down. And again, remember I've got the busiest part of the song looped so that I can then mix all these elements together, and then the rest of the song will be inherently mixed. So you bring it in. Again, you're looking for a very balanced sound. A lot of the tweaks you can do later, but at the very start you're looking to make sure that everything sounds even. And again, I might go in and tweak the EQ just so that the bass pierces through a little bit more. I've got that bass going to what's called New York bass parallel compression. I'll explain that later. So then I've also got this bass. Let me see what this is. Oh, that's a sub. That's just a sub bass I've played in a synth just to give it a bit of lower end grit. A sub is basically such a low frequency that you often maybe don't even hear it with your ears, but on certain types of speakers you can feel it. It's that low end. So I had added that in just to give it a bit of oomph. The next element, I guess, I would have added and would have been whatever's most important in the song. In this case, would have been this string spiccato. Yeah. Now this is probably the first element that I can discuss the pan in. So what I've done is I've bounced down. This was really made of 2 layers, but I've bounced it as 4 so that I could do some panning effects. I've got, yeah, look, so this is the same 2 tracks and the same 2 here. But up here I've got that pan to the left and that pan to the right. This pan slightly to the left, slightly to the right. So this panning's something that's quite important when it comes to space in a mix. Now if you want the song to be big and like 3D as I described earlier, you want to use panning to sort of separate certain parts. And you can get really, really technical and granular with panning as well, but I'm not going to go into it. As you can see here from this song, I just wanted this plucky string to sound quite spaced out. Now the next layer of this song, mix-wise, in terms of the heaviness, is the guitar. It's quite quiet. I've used these amps, Sunshine Stack to Soar, and again I've said about this in the last video, I've probably used something different for each one. Yeah, that's a heavy guitar. And I'm pretty sure from memory these 3 guitar parts are pretty much playing the same part, maybe it's playing slightly different parts of the guitar so that the layers complement each other and harmonize, even if you're playing the same thing, by spreading out the performances. And again, I've probably used some pan in here. Yes, I have. Look, the right, one guitar's pan to the right, one guitar's pan to the left, and the other one's in the middle. And I've EQ'd so that a lot of the low end's been cut out. Now, even though these are heavy guitars, I want that distortion to cut through in the mix. Anything from the bass end of that is going to come from the bass. Now that's really, really important point when it comes to mixing. It might seem like you're working backwards, but you might cut the bass out of an element that has got bass in it. For example, if I've got a piano in a song and I've got a bass, I'll actually cut a lot of the bass out of the piano, which might not sound good if you solo the piano, but when it's combined with the bass, it sounds perfect. And that's like one of the most important things I learned about mixing too is about using EQ to cut the frequency so that the tracks fit together in the mix. Now if you solo each of these layers, they might sound rubbish, they might sound tinny, thin, but when you combine them, they should sound huge. And that's if I could explain what mixing is in the shortest way, that would be it. It's shaping sounds so that they all belong together as if they've been performed together. Now the next element of this song is my organ. There you go, I've got 2 of them actually. That was the Leeds Town Hall organ that I showed you in the last video. Again, there's so many layers to this epic part that it was really tricky to balance them, so you might not actually hear the organ the way I've got it mixed. At this stage, I was just making sure everything's balanced so you can hear it. And I want to remind you here that I've got this mono on. If I was to turn that off, listen to how the mix changes. See how it suddenly becomes 3D? Now that is quite literally just a little trick I learned. If you can balance everything out using your ears while the track is in mono, and it all sounds as clear as you think you can get it and as balanced as you can get it, then you turn off that mono and suddenly the song, it becomes 3D. That's the best way I can describe it. Now, it's not everyone will use that. It's just something I learned and it's something I like to do. You might turn it off and actually tweak again later, but this during the gain staging process, which is the balance and everything out stage, it's perfect. Next we've got our hurdy. Pretty sure it's a hurdy-gurdy. Let me just. Yeah. It sounds a bit disgusting, but I just wanted to layer up this heavy section with some really gritty and unusual sounds. And in the end of the mix, you might not even really hear some of them, but when they're all combined, they're thick and meaty, you know. So that hurdy-gurdy doesn't sound particularly good on its own. So I've got a different sounding organ here. See how rich and full that sounds? This is my synth organ. See how they all complement each other in their own space? I mean, I'll bring in the sirens next. So these sirens are what I call J-bends in the last video. Are they wah a lot like here, they kind of have this warpy siren effect. I've got each of these feeding through an amp. Now I think that sounds really metal. Let me turn them up a little bit. I've cut the low end out because bass. I've used a spreader, a stereo spreader. Again, it comes with presets. It just changes the space of the sound, the layer in the mix. I mean, how great does that sound? Combine that with the organs. The guitars. See how it builds this wall of sound? The wall of sounds, I mean, it is quite literally layering as many things as you can together to make this big wall, but it's about shaping each of these sounds so that they're not trying to compete with each other. And I mean, most of the time, it's the trick is use the EQ to color them to cut stuff out. So a massive part of this is the fact that I've got this really um, specific bass sound that takes up a specific frequency, this area, and then I'm able to cut that same area out of all these layers, and then that'll allow those two parts to sit nicely together. Now then again, like I've just got more strings. These are the, let me just show you the strings alone. I showed you these in the last video. It's my orchestral area. The only thing I've done, I've just, again, I've cut the low end out. This is, you would put an EQ on almost every track and cut some of the low end out, the frequencies that the ear can't hear, because those frequencies, even though you can't hear them, they can cause a bit of muddiness. And I've got these panned. So you hear how that sounds with the gain on, the mono on the whole track. Now again, like this is a perfect example of reverb. I've just got each of these tracks feeding to different reverb that I've set up again on these master buses. These are all set up, so now by feeding each of these, I fed that one slightly through reverb 2. This one's through a bigger reverb, which is reverb 3. This is just a taste thing. I like to use a little bit of reverb 3, which is the big reverb, a little bit of the medium, but that's putting them into the same space, which listen, they sound like they're in the same hall, don't they? And you can just tweak these where they are in the mix, where they are in the space, the panning. You can bring them up. And again, it's all about balance. For me, that's the biggest step, getting these all balanced. And again, like I say, you can mix them in their own groups. So you might mix these 4 strings together while they're soloed, but you also then want to make sure that every layer, like the string section and the drums, sit well together. The bass and the the strings. Let me just play you through a little bit of this heavy section now. And I've got this EBow, which is a really cool effect. An EBow is actually this mechanical device that you can put on a guitar, and it vibrates and creates this amazing sort of wishy-washy distortion effect. I use a synth for it. I didn't show it in the last video, but it just creates a bit of atmosphere. It's almost like a ringing. Now, I've balanced everything out, like I've just shown you just now. Now you would play through the rest of the song and check that everything's balanced and tweak it from there. So I would open up this again and maybe go, that kick could be slightly louder. And you know that you can push that kick up a little bit and it won't affect the rest of the song. Or maybe, maybe you'll tweak something as big as the bass here. Get some more of the track in. All these computer effects, I didn't really talk about them, but basically they're very low. They're like what I call ear candy background stuff to add interest. I added a super VHS effect on those. It's something I use in a lot of the retro 80s music. It's not letting me open it. That's basically a warp effect. It's got this great 80s. It's almost like a chorus effect or a tape saturation. If you add that to any element, it'll make it sound a bit more analog or a bit like it's warped, like that cheesy retro sound. So yeah, what I'll do next is just play through the track as it's mixed, as it's gain staged. Everything's balanced, everything's nice. And I'll listen, like I'm listening now. I've got these 3 Oliver strings that had that little bed of background. Sound slightly out of tune, don't they? Put them very low again. It's just to add that little bit of detail, a little bit of color. So yeah, I'm listening through now and I can just tweak as is. Everything's well balanced. I can say, all right, I like that a little bit louder. It's all about just using your ears to balance everything out. And that's the basics of mixing a track from scratch. Now the next part would be shaping things that are problems. So you might think the bass isn't cutting through properly. If there's something not quite right about it, you might go in and then add some effects to the bass individually, or as I've done, add a parallel compressor. That's set in the bass to a separate channel that's got its own effect. This VEQ. And then it feeds that back. That's essentially what parallel compression is. It creates a second channel and a second signal, like a duplicate of the track, and then combines the new signal with the first signal without it becoming louder. I mean, this mix wasn't so hard because I really got the sounds right to begin with. Mixing is generally harder. I mean, it's much harder if you're recording it like a live band and everything's a bit messier. It's very clean when you're using these polished sample libraries and software synths. You can get the sounds like quite balanced in the writing session, almost sort of do a sub mix, and then this stage is just about giving it that 3D space. Also mastering, which I'm not going to get into, but you can add a mastering to the master channel. It's not recommended. You should always master later, but I do sometimes chuck it on there just to hear how the song sounds mastered and unmastered. And I've got this brightener, exciter, sorry. Let me just play through the track. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. I think I've gone on a bit long here. That's how I mixed this track. And again, the last stage is after everything's balanced, it's just making it pop a little bit more, fixing any little problems, listening to it, making sure that everything cuts through and that everything's got its own space. The very last thing you might do is what's called automation. Automation, here's some I've done here, is where you'll control each layer of the track as the song progresses. You'll literally draw a line. So this is like says that as the song moves along, this effect turns up, this effect turns down. You can automate the volume, you can automate these faders. Imagine like a band playing and the guitar player's coming in at a certain point and he's stepping forward on the stage. Well, you might want to emulate that effect where the volume of the guitar goes up slightly or slightly down, that kind of thing. But yeah, I've wrapped up. This song wasn't, the only complicated part was balancing out this epic ending, and like I said, I've done that mostly through EQ and compression. Last thing to do really is just to play through the track. I've got my mastering on, my exciter, and I've got my mono. Always make sure to turn that mono off. And like I say, let me just show you how the track changes. You can hear that difference. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope that wasn't too drawn out.